62 black ships cut across the Atlantic, like knives through skin. 4,000 warriors, 3 years away from home, no retreat planned. To the men aboard, this was not exploration, it was escalation. They believed the world still feared them. They believed terror was a weapon that never dulled. They believed surprise was eternal. They were wrong. In the year 859 CE, a Viking armada sailed into the Mediterranean and into a system that had already learned how to kill them. What followed was not a glorious saga, but a slow, brutal lesson in logistics, engineering, and the price of overreach. This is the story of Bjorn Ironside, not as legend, but as a case study in how empires end raiding cultures. To understand why Bjorn pushed south when every rational signal screamed retreat, you have to step outside modern military thinking. Vikings did not measure success through logistics or long-term sustainability. They lived inside an economy of prestige, where reputation was power and survival depended on visible victory. Returning home empty-handed was not a temporary failure. It was political suicide. A failed expedition shattered alliances, collapsed marriages, and dissolved loyalty almost overnight. Authority among the Norse was never stable. It had to be earned again and again through risk and reward. Bjorn carried a burden heavier than most. He was not judged as an individual leader, but as the continuation of a legend. Ragnar had humiliated Paris and struck at the heart of Christian Europe. Bjorn could not return with caution or restraint. He needed something larger, something impossible. The Mediterranean was not simply a destination. It was a gamble, a desperate wager for survival within Viking society itself. The Vikings believed they were sailing into a soft world of wealthy cities and undefended gold, a southern mirror of the northern coasts they had terrorized for generations. What they did not understand was that the last Viking raid had already changed everything. 15 years earlier, Norse forces had burned Seville to the ground. That moment did not fade into memory. It hardened into policy. The response from the Emirate of Cordoba was permanent and systemic. This was not a temporary mobilization or a feudal levy raised in panic. Cordoba rebuilt its coastline the way a modern state would prepare for war. Watchtowers linked the shore in chains of visibility. Signal fires transmitted movement in real time. Rapid response fleets waited in fortified ports. Warships were designed not for trade, but for interception. Crews were professional sailors, trained to fight at sea. Incendiary weapons were developed specifically to destroy wooden hulls from a distance. This was not fear reacting to terror. It was preparation replacing it. The Vikings sailed south, believing reputation alone would open gates and empty cities. Cordoba had already learned the lesson they had not. Fear fades, systems endure. The clash off Lisbon was never meant to be a fair fight, and it was never designed to decide the war. It was an experiment, a test of what happened when Viking bravery collided with a system built to counter it. Viking longships were masterpieces of Atlantic raiding. They were light, flexible, and fast, perfect for rivers, beaches, and sudden landings where speed mattered more than protection. But in open naval combat, those same strengths became vulnerabilities. The ships sat low in the water, open to fire, and offered little defense against attacks from above. The Andalusian galleys were taller, heavier, and purpose-built for confrontation at sea. More importantly, they carried a weapon the North had never truly faced on water: liquid fire. Naphtha burned even as it floated, clung to wood and sailcloth, and ignored shields entirely. The Vikings responded the only way they knew how. They charged. That instinct saved some of them. It condemned many others. Lisbon was never meant to destroy the fleet. It was meant to slow it, and that lost time would become lethal later. Crossing the Strait of Gibraltar changed everything, not because the Vikings entered a new sea, but because they entered a new kind of world. The Atlantic is an ocean. It is vast, forgiving, and chaotic enough to disappear inside. A fleet can scatter, hide behind distance, and let weather erase pursuit. The Mediterranean is nothing like that. It is a closed basin, dense with cities, trade routes, and memory. Every movement leaves a trace. Every sail is noticed. The Vikings mistook access for control. They believed that passing the gate meant freedom to operate. In reality, crossing the strait meant stepping into visibility. Once inside, smoke signals followed their progress along the coast. Ports were warned before the ships appeared on the horizon. Garrisons reinforced positions days in advance. Fleets shifted to intercept rather than react. None of this was accidental. It was not luck, and it was not fear. It was a coordinated system doing exactly what it had been built to do. The Vikings did not sail into a hunting ground. They sailed into a cage. The sack of Luna is often remembered as a moment of Viking cleverness, a legendary trick pulled off through audacity and deception. In reality, it was something far less romantic. It was desperation. By the time Bjorn reached the Italian coast, his expedition was bleeding. Ships had been lost. Men were dead or wounded. Momentum was slipping away with every fortified shoreline they passed. The Vikings were no longer capable of storming walled cities by force. Another failed assault would have meant annihilation. So they lied. The false funeral was not a stroke of genius born from confidence. It was a gamble born from necessity. Medieval cities were built to resist siege engines and armies, not ritual deception wrapped in religious custom. The gates opened because the defenders did not imagine that faith itself could be weaponized. The sack succeeded, the city fell, gold flowed, and then Bjorn learned the truth. This was not Rome. What followed was not strategy, calculation, or restraint. It was rage, unleashed on stone and flesh alike, the fury of a man realizing that even victory could still be failure. The return west was inevitable. Once the Mediterranean closed around them, there was only one way out, and everyone involved knew it. The trap was already set. Across the narrow throat of the strait, the Cordoban fleet did not pursue or harass. It waited. This was not impatience or hesitation. It was calculation. What followed was naval mathematics executed with precision. The defenders held the wind. Their ships carried fire weapons designed to kill at range. The Viking longships were heavy with loot, riding low and slow in the water. There were no open lanes for retreat, no space to scatter, no horizon to disappear into. When the fire began, it was not a battle in any meaningful sense. It was an execution. Flames spread across decks in moments. Ships burned without ever making contact. 2/3 of the armada was destroyed in minutes. The survivors escaped only by doing the unthinkable. They threw their wealth into the sea, trading gold for speed and survival for legend. Starving and broken, the survivors understood that the old rules no longer applied. They no longer had the strength to raid cities, burn ports, or challenge armies in the field. What remained of Bjorn's force was too small, too exposed, and too fragile for traditional Viking warfare, so they changed the target. They stopped raiding territory and began raiding power itself. The kidnapping of the king of Pamplona was not an act of blind brutality. It was economic warfare carried out with ruthless clarity. A living king was worth more than any church or city. His capture placed an entire kingdom in a dilemma between financial ruin and political collapse. 70,000 gold coins replaced what fire and steel had destroyed. An entire lost fleet was restored in value through a single hostage. Bjorn did not win this campaign on the battlefield. He survived it through leverage, calculation, and coercion. That distinction matters because it marks the moment when Viking violence shifted from conquest to extraction. This expedition did not expand Viking power, and it did not open a new age of conquest. What it destroyed was something far more important. It ended the illusion of Viking invincibility. After 859, the Mediterranean was no longer a place of opportunity. Its coastlines hardened. Patrol fleets became permanent, not reactive. Watch systems stayed lit, year-round. Surprise! The Vikings' most lethal weapon simply vanished. The era of easy raids came to an end, not through one decisive battle, but through learning. Some Vikings adapted, captured survivors, converted, settled, married into local populations, and entered the service of the very states they had once terrorized. Former raiders became soldiers, farmers, and mercenaries inside organized systems that no longer feared them. The world had changed, and more importantly, it had learned. The Vikings were no longer mythological demons arriving from the sea. They were men who could be tracked, intercepted, burned, and broken. Fear had failed. Preparation had won. This story is not told to celebrate heroes or glorify conquest. It exists to examine what happens when systems collide, when a culture built on speed, fear, and surprise meets opponents who adapt, organize, and learn. This raid matters because it reveals how raiding societies fail once they encounter structured states that can absorb shock and respond systematically. It shows how fear stops working the moment enemies stop panicking and start preparing. And it exposes how mythology is constructed, not from the full truth, but from the narrow perspective of those who survived long enough to tell the tale. Bjorn Ironside did not conquer the Mediterranean. He reached its limits and barely escaped them alive. The sagas call the expedition a victory. History reads it differently. It was a warning. The Vikings did not fade because they grew weak or lost their courage. They stopped because the world around them grew stronger. And nowhere did that reality burn more clearly than in the waters of the Mediterranean.